2 canvas tennis shoes. That's what they found first. Sitting on the cold linoleum floor of a remote Forestry Service trailer, 19 miles deep into the Plumas National Forest, with the quiet patience of objects that have been set down and will not be picked up again. No laces untied in panic, no boot kicked sideways in haste. Just 2 worn sneakers, placed neatly on the floor beside a bunk bed, as if their owner had every intention of coming back for them. Their owner was not coming back. 19 miles down the mountain, locked at the edge of a snow line on an unmarked logging road that shouldn't have been navigable in February, investigators had already found the Mercury Montego. Doors unlocked. Engine ready to start. Gas still in the tank. 5 men had walked away from a working car into a 0-degree blizzard, and the car had waited for them in the dark like a faithful dog that hadn't yet been told its owners were gone. 4 of those 5 men had been accounted for, 3 in the wilderness. Their remains scattered by the mountain and the animals that had moved through it by the time the snow cleared. 1 in the trailer, on the bunk bed, wrapped in 8 canvas blankets, dead of starvation, surrounded by a year's worth of food. But the 5th man. The 5th man had taken the dead man's boots. Let that specific detail sink in, because it is the most disturbing single fact in this entire case, and it barely gets discussed. Gary Mathias. The 5th man. The one who had made it through 19 miles of mountain blizzard in sneakers and a spring jacket. The one who had survived the impossible walk and reached the shelter and spent weeks inside that trailer. Had at some point stood up, unlaced his canvas shoes, set them down with a deliberateness that contradicts every theory about mindless panic, reached for the leather. Hiking boots belonging to the man dying on the bunk bed, forced his feet into a dead man's footwear, and walked back out through the broken window into the Sierra Nevada winter. He walked northwest. The tracking dogs followed his scent for less than a quarter mile before it ended. Not faded, not scattered by wind, but ended, as if Gary Mathias had stepped off the surface of the earth. He has never been found. Not a bone, not a thread of his jacket, not a buckle from the borrowed boots. Nothing. In a wilderness ecosystem that reduces a human body to scattered fragments within weeks, Gary Mathias has been completely, permanently, and inexplicably absent from the physical record for nearly 50 years. This is not the story of a disappearance. This is the story of a mind, a specific, documented, clinically understood mind that was put under conditions so extreme that it rewrote its own survival programming in real time, and produced an outcome that trained wilderness investigators, federal agents, and forensic psychologists have never been able to fully explain. Tonight, we are not going back to the logging road. We are not going back to the abandoned car. We are going somewhere more claustrophobic and more frightening than any mountain in February. We are going inside. Welcome to Midnight Whispers. If you've never joined us before, hit subscribe and turn on every notification, because this is what we do, and we go all the way in. Let's go back to the beginning of Gary Mathias, not to the mountain, to Germany. To understand what Gary Mathias did in that cabin, and what he did when he left it, you have to go back approximately 4 years before the mountain. You have to go to a military barracks in West Germany in the mid-1970s, and you have to understand what happened to a young, physically imposing, disciplined American soldier when his brain chemistry began to shift beneath him without warning. Gary Mathias was the kind of recruit that military trainers notice. Athletic, coordinated, possessed of an intensity and focus that the structured environment of the U.S. Army brought out rather than suppressed. He was not a troubled kid looking for direction. He was someone who had found a framework that suited him. He thrived in the discipline, the physical demands, the clear hierarchy of obligation and reward. The fracture, when it came from inside. No external trigger that investigators could point to. No traumatic event, no combat experience, no obvious catalyst. The mind simply began to do what certain minds, under certain biological circumstances, begin to do when the scaffolding that holds reality in place starts to loosen. It started with sounds, faint scratching from behind the concrete barracks walls. Not rats, not pipes. The specific kind of scratching that comes from inside the structure itself, from within the spaces where no physical thing should be making sounds. Gary heard it first at night, then in the morning, Then in the middle of conversations that the sounds interrupted more effectively than any voice could. Then the scratching acquired language. The voices that developed were not vague or atmospheric. They were specific, authoritative, and addressed to Gary directly. They told him things about the people around him, things that were impossible to verify but felt more true than anything Gary's own eyes were showing him. His fellow soldiers were poisoning his food. The military police were tracking his vital signs through the floorboards. There was something waiting for him outside the gates, something without a clear face or a name, but with a presence so certain that Gary began to avoid the exit as if the threshold itself was dangerous. The army moved quickly once the behavioral symptoms made the situation impossible to manage in the ordinary structure of daily duty. Gary was evaluated, diagnosed, and discharged. The diagnosis: severe paranoid schizophrenia. The prognosis at the time was not optimistic. Treatment-resistant, meaning the first medications tried didn't work, requiring the kind of careful, long, trial-and-error process of finding the right combination that could take years and offered no guarantees. During his worst episodes before treatment stabilized him, Gary's behavior included extended periods of wandering the German countryside barefoot. Not because he was confused about where he was going, but because something in his disrupted perception made the cold ground preferable to whatever was inside the building he'd left. He walked in temperatures that should have registered as dangerous and appeared not to register them at all. This detail, barefoot in the cold, immune to what the body should be screaming about temperature, will matter enormously later. File it. Gary came home to Yuba City and to the people who loved him most. His mother. His stepfather, Bob Kelsey, who ran a small business and who gave Gary a job there, not out of charity, but because Gary was capable and Bob understood that meaningful work was part of what kept a person tethered. Gary needed structure. He had structure. He needed routine. He had routine. He needed his medication taken at consistent intervals. He was taking it. By early 1978, Gary Mathias had been stable for 2 consecutive years. Not managing, not barely holding on. Stable. Regular appointments, consistent medication, social connections, a job he showed up to, plans for the future. His family described him with a combination of gratitude and caution. The caution of people who love someone whose wellness is maintained by a set of conditions that must be sustained continuously, like a structure that requires constant maintenance to remain sound. On February 23, 1978, Gary climbed into the Mercury Montego with his 4 friends to watch a basketball game in Chico. He told his mother he'd be back in the morning. He had a Special Olympics tournament the next day, something he had been preparing for, something he was looking forward to. He packed nothing for an overnight stay. No change of clothes, no overnight bag. And in the glove compartment of the car, sealed in a small plastic bag, was Gary Mathias's antipsychotic medication, stelazine and cogentin. The 2 drugs that, in combination, kept the walls of the barracks quiet and the shape waiting outside the gates at bay. He had taken his evening dose. The medication in his system, at the concentration present when the car left Chico, would maintain therapeutic levels for approximately 24 hours. The car turned onto the logging road sometime in the late hours of February 23rd. The clock had started. We do not know with complete certainty what compelled the 5 men to leave the car. We don't know who made the decision, how it was communicated, or whether it was a decision in any formal sense. A consensus reached through discussion, or whether it was one person's panic that the others followed because they had no better alternative in the dark. What we know is the physical record of what followed. The snow. The temperature. 19 miles of mountain terrain at altitude, in February, in conditions that the subsequent investigation would document as severe, even by the standards of that region in winter. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling died first, almost certainly within the first 48 hours. Their remains were found less than a mile from the cabin, separated from it by terrain that, in the conditions of that night, might as well have been 100 miles. They got close. The cold got to them first. Jack Huet's remains were found farther northwest of the cabin, suggesting a different path, possibly a different point of collapse, possibly a different timeline. The mountain took him. It was not quick and it was not peaceful, but it was complete. Ted Ware and Gary Mathias kept moving. The psychological and physiological explanation for why these two specifically continued when the others did not is something investigators and researchers have examined from multiple angles. The most supported explanation involves Gary. Not Gary's strength, necessarily, but Gary's specific neurological state at that point in the walk. Here is something that clinical literature on untreated schizophrenia documents clearly. In the early stages of acute decompensation, the period immediately after antipsychotic medication begins to leave a person's system. Patients frequently experience a paradoxical state of elevated energy, heightened alertness, and what can only be described as a kind of manic vigilance. The voices are returning, but they haven't yet overwhelmed the system. The paranoid certainty is building, but it hasn't yet immobilized. What it produces, in the short term, is something that looks from the outside like extraordinary drive. Gary Mathias, approximately 12 to 24 hours off his medication, moving through a mountain blizzard at night, may have been operating in exactly this state. Not calm, not rational, but energized in the specific, unsustainable way that an acute psychiatric episode can energize someone. Burning through reserves at a rate the body can't maintain, but burning through them. And Ted followed Gary. Because in the darkness and the cold and the disorientation, Gary was the one who was still moving forward. And forward, at that point, was the only direction that offered any possibility of survival. They reached the trailer. They broke through a window pane. They went inside. And here is where the story stops being about survival and starts being about something far more psychologically complex. 11 weeks. Take a moment to understand what 11 weeks inside that trailer actually means. Not 11 days, not 11 nights, 11 full weeks. Approximately 77 days, during which Gary Mathias was sealed inside a small, dark, isolated space in the mountains with a dying man, with no human contact, no medication, and a mind that was unraveling at a rate that the absence of treatment makes clinically inevitable. Let's be specific about what happens to a person with paranoid schizophrenia when antipsychotic medication is withdrawn. The timeline varies by individual and by the specific medications involved, but the general progression is well documented. In the first week or two, the pharmaceutical cushion fades, but the acute symptoms haven't fully returned. The person may feel anxious, agitated, unable to sleep, but they are still functioning in recognizable ways. By week 3 to 4, the psychotic symptoms begin to reassert themselves. The auditory hallucinations return, first quiet, then insistent. The paranoid ideation begins to rebuild its architecture. The specific, internally consistent logic of who is a threat, what the threat is, how it is being delivered. This architecture, once constructed, feels more real than the physical environment. It doesn't contradict the physical environment. It explains it, incorporates it, makes the physical environment evidence for what the voices are saying. By week 6 to 8, without any external reality checks and under the additional stress of physical deprivation, the architecture can become total. Not just strong, total. The person is no longer someone who hears voices while also perceiving shared reality. They are someone for whom the voice-generated reality is the only reality. Now place that progression inside a dark trailer in the Sierra Nevada. No windows that let in useful light. No other human voice providing a counter-narrative. Whined against the metal roof that sounds, at certain frequencies, like things trying to get in. The smell of a man dying in the adjacent bunk. Complete isolation from every anchor to the world that had been keeping Gary functional. His mother, his stepfather, his medication, his job, his routine, his doctor. And yet, the physical evidence in that trailer tells a story that is harder to reconcile with the image of a mind in total collapse than most people realize. Ted Ware was wrapped in 8 canvas blankets, meticulously. The blankets were tucked under his body with a care and precision that is physically impossible for a man in Ted's condition. Both hands rendered non-functional by advanced frostbite to have performed for himself. The medical examiner noted the specific way the corners were folded, the evenness of the coverage, the care with which the wrapping had been done. Someone sat beside that bed in the dark and tucked Ted Ware in. Repeatedly, most likely. Over the weeks, as the temperature shifted and the blankets needed adjustment, someone was there checking on him, keeping him covered, performing the one act of physical care that was possible when everything else had become impossible. Gary Mathias did this. In the depths of an acute, unmedicated schizophrenic episode, stripped of every external support that had maintained his stability for 2 years, Gary Mathias was still, on some level, caring for his friend. This is not inconsistent with what we know about paranoid schizophrenia. The voices and the paranoid architecture, even in severe cases, don't necessarily eliminate the person's relationships or their emotional orientation toward the people they love. What they distort is threat perception and reality architecture. Gary may not have been able to trust the food, the labeled cans with their bright colors that a paranoid mind could read as warnings rather than descriptions. He may not have been able to operate the butane system, a large tank connected to an ignition mechanism that, to a mind convinced that external entities were trying to destroy the shelter, could easily have been reframed as an explosive device. But the person lying on the bunk, Ted, someone he had known, someone he had walked 19 miles through a blizzard alongside. That relationship was still present in whatever remained of Gary's accessible emotional landscape. So he sat in the dark, and he tucked the blankets in, and he watched his friend get smaller. 9 cans were opened over the course of Ted Ware's time in that cabin. 9. For a person of Ted's size and metabolic needs, 9 cans of military rations over 11 weeks is starvation by increments. The math is not ambiguous. Whether Gary's paranoid architecture prevented more cans from being opened, or whether Ted was simply too incapacitated to open them and Gary was too unwell to consistently initiate feeding him, the result was the same. Ted Ware weighed 80 pounds when they found him. He had come in weighing 200. Gary had watched that happen. Every day, over 11 weeks, Gary had watched the number of blankets needed to cover Ted's frame stay the same while the frame underneath them diminished. When Ted finally died, the evidence suggests sometime in late April or early May, based on the progression of decomposition against the known temperature conditions. Gary Mathias was alone in the trailer with a corpse, and the last thread connecting him to anything resembling shared human reality was gone. The gold watch was still on the nightstand. This detail has generated more speculation than almost any other single piece of evidence in the entire Yuba County 5 case. The watch did not belong to Ted Ware. It did not belong to Gary Mathias. It did not belong to any of the other 3 men. Its owner has never been identified. It was simply there, on the nightstand beside Ted Ware's body, placed by a hand that no one has ever been able to name. Gary knew that watch was there. He had been in the trailer for 11 weeks. Whatever it meant to him, whether it registered as a normal object or as something else in the symbolic landscape of his unmedicated mind, he left it behind when he left. He also left Ted's wallet. He left the remaining food. He left the canvas shoes. He took the boots. The boots were Ted Ware's. Heavy, leather, insulated hiking boots. The kind of footwear that represents the difference between surviving and not surviving in mountain conditions. Gary's canvas tennis shoes, at this point, were almost certainly destroyed by weeks of exposure to cold and damp. They were functionally useless against what was outside, so the boot exchange itself makes a certain terrible practical sense. What doesn't make sense, what resists every framework of rational decision-making, is the direction Gary walked in when he left. He walked northwest, deeper into the forest, away from the valley, away from the lights and the roads and the possibility of encountering another human being who might have recognized him, or simply seen that he needed help. He walked toward more wilderness, more cold, more isolation. Psychologists who have studied this case have offered a framework for understanding this that the literature calls a psychotic exodus, a phenomenon observed in severe, long-duration acute psychotic episodes where the patient's threat architecture becomes so total that the most dangerous environment appears to be where other people are, and the safest possible direction is away from all of them. The cold is no longer the enemy. The cold is neutral. The cold doesn't have a voice. The cold can't lie to you or poison your food or track your movements through the floorboards. In Gary's world, the specific, detailed, internally consistent world that 11 weeks of unmedicated paranoid schizophrenia had constructed around him. Going back down the mountain toward civilization may have been the most terrifying option available. The people down there, in that world, were the source of the threat. The people down there were why they had come up the mountain in the first place. So he went the other way. He went deeper. The summer search of 1978 was extensive by any measure. FBI agents, state police, specialized search and rescue teams, canine tracking units trained for exactly this type of terrain and scenario. The investigation was motivated not just by the case itself, but by the unprecedented public attention it had received. The Yuba County Five had become national news, and the absence of Gary Mathias was the open wound at the center of a story that the media was not willing to let close. The tracking dogs did what they were trained to do. They were given Gary's scent from the canvas shoes, most likely left on the linoleum floor of the trailer, and they followed it for approximately 200 yards northwest of the trailer window, through the underbrush, into the timber, and then the scent ended. Not diminished, not scattered by wind or rain in a way that would indicate a gradual dispersal. It simply stopped, as if the trail had been surgically removed from the physical record. This kind of scent cessation can have several explanations in tracking work. A water crossing, a creek or snowmelt stream, can break a scent trail completely if the subject waded through it. Movement across bare rock, where the oils from a person's footwear don't transfer to any absorbent surface, can reduce or eliminate a scent trail. A vehicle pickup, someone in a car stopping on a road to offer a ride, after which the subject's trail moves to asphalt that dogs can't follow effectively, can also produce an abrupt stop. All of these were considered. None of them were confirmed. The creek crossing theory requires a creek in the right location at the right time, with conditions that would allow a severely malnourished, mentally ill person to navigate it. Possible, but not documented. The rock crossing theory requires extended bare rock in that part of the forest, which investigators found limited evidence of. The vehicle pickup theory requires a road close enough to the search area and a driver who would have encountered Gary Mathias, taken him somewhere, and either not recognized him from the missing persons alerts or not come forward to report it. That last theory is the one that certain investigators return to when they discuss this case in private years later, because it carries a specific implication. If Gary Mathias was picked up by a vehicle in the summer of 1978, he was either in a condition that made him immediately recognizable as someone in severe distress, in which case, why didn't the driver report it? Or he was in a condition that made him appear, to a stranger who didn't know his face, like a thin, weathered man hitchhiking on a mountain road. Unusual, perhaps. Not unambiguously someone to call the police about. In the second scenario, Gary Mathias might have ridden out of the Plumas National Forest in the cab of a truck or the back seat of a car and arrived in some town. Reno, Sacramento, somewhere along the California-Nevada border, and simply disappeared into the population of people who live on the edges of society, without identification, without a coherent account of who they are, without the kind of paper trail that makes a person findable. There are documented cases of psychiatric patients who, in severe states of decompensation, traveled hundreds of miles from their last known location and were not found for years. Some were never found. The person who answers to a name and maintains a consistent identity is a person living inside the shared social reality. Gary Mathias, in the summer of 1978, may not have been that person anymore. And then there is the other theory. The one that the case of Joseph Shawns keeps alive. Shawns, the man who suffered a cardiac event on that same mountain road on the night of February 23rd, who lay in his car and saw headlights pull up behind the Mercury Montego, who heard voices including what he identified as a woman's voice, who saw flashlights moving in the trees. Described what sounds like a second group of people on that mountain that night. People who heard him call for help and extinguished their lights. If that second group was real, and there is no physical evidence that they weren't, only a logical preference for explaining them as hallucination that may or may not be warranted. Then the question of who brought 5 vulnerable men up an unmarked logging road in the dark in winter takes on a completely different character. And Gary Mathias, walking northwest out of that trailer in a dead man's boots, may not have been walking away from something inside the cabin. He may have been walking towards something he believed was waiting for him in the trees. Something that, in 11 weeks of isolated psychosis, he had become convinced he needed to find. Gary Mathias was declared legally dead in 1992, 14 years after he walked out of a broken window into the Sierra Nevada winter. The legal declaration of death is an administrative necessity. It allows estates to be settled, records to be closed, the machinery of institutional reality to process an absence that the physical world has left unresolved. It does not answer where he went. Nearly 50 years have passed since February 23, 1978. The logging road has changed. The trees have grown. The forestry trailer was removed at some point in the years after the investigation concluded. The places where Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling and Jack Huet died have been absorbed back into the mountain, unmarked, ordinary. The canvas tennis shoes that Gary Mathias left on the linoleum floor of the trailer were inventoried by investigators and then disappeared into the storage of an evidence system that has since been reorganized multiple times. Whether they still exist in some archive or storage facility is not publicly documented. What persists is the psychological case study. The specific, documented, clinically verifiable sequence of what happened to Gary Mathias's mind from the moment the Mercury Montego turned onto that logging road, through the 19-mile walk, through 11 weeks in an isolated cabin, to the morning, or evening, or pre-dawn hour, we don't know. When he laced his feet into Ted Ware's boots and stepped back into the cold. And what persists, for those who study this case seriously, is the question that no forensic psychologist, no wilderness investigator, no specialist in psychiatric crisis has been able to fully answer. At the end, at the moment Gary Mathias made the specific, deliberate decision to set his own shoes on the floor and reach for the dead man's boots, what did he understand about what he was doing? Was he, on some level, lucid? Did some fragment of the Gary Mathias who had spent 2 years carefully maintaining his stability, who had worked for his stepfather and attended his medical appointments and told his mother he'd be home in the morning, did that person briefly surface? Look around at the inside of the trailer, understand what had happened and what was likely to happen next, and choose the boots as the best available. Option for an attempt to survive? Or was the decision made entirely within the internal logic of a reality that bore no relationship to the one his shoes were sitting in? Was he not putting on boots to walk out of the mountain, but completing some action that made perfect sense in the architecture of his psychosis, that answered a directive from the voices, that fulfilled a requirement of the paranoid world he had been living in for months? We don't know. The answer left with him, into the snow, and whatever the answer was, it left no tracks. The Plumas National Forest tonight is exactly what it has always been. Cold in winter, indifferent to the questions we bring to it. The trees that were saplings in 1978 are old trees now. The creeks that may or may not have covered Gary Mathias's trail still run where they ran then, still indifferent to what they know and we don't. The case of Gary Mathias is not a ghost story in the traditional sense. It doesn't require supernatural explanation. Everything that happened has a human account available to it. Tragic, comprehensible in the clinical sense, heartbreaking in the human sense. What makes it ghost story adjacent is the absence. The specific, absolute, half-century absence of a body in a wilderness ecosystem that should not have been able to produce such a clean disappearance. The scent trail that ended. The boots that were never found. And the question that every serious student of this case eventually arrives at, usually alone and usually at a late hour, what if the absence isn't the mystery? What if the absence is the answer? Just one we don't have the language for yet? Gary Mathias was a person who, for 2 years, had successfully maintained his equilibrium by holding on to a very specific set of anchors: medication, routine, relationship, structure, purpose. He had learned what it cost to live well, and he had been paying it consistently every day. The mountain stripped those anchors away one at a time. The medication first, then the other people, then the warmth, then the food, then the last other person. And what was left walked northwest into the snow in borrowed boots. The honest, uncomfortable truth that this case sits with, the thing that keeps it alive in the minds of people who encounter it, is not the mystery of where Gary went. It's the recognition of how much of what we take for granted about our own stability depends on exactly the kind of infrastructure that Gary lost. The people who know us. The chemical balances we don't have to think about. The routines that organize the day. The structures that tell us who we are when we are alone. Remove those things, one at a time, under sufficient pressure, over sufficient time. Then ask yourself what would be left, what direction it would walk. I'm not saying your answer would be Gary's answer, but I am saying the question deserves more than a comfortable assumption. Drop your theory in the comments. I want to hear what you think happened on that mountain, and what you think Gary Mathias understood in the moment he put on those boots. The most compelling analysis gets featured in the next episode. Thank you for spending this dark hour with Midnight Whispers. If this psychological deep dive shook something loose, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to think about something difficult tonight. Sleep well, and maybe, before you do, make sure your anchors are where you left them.